What's going on, everybody? It is Mr. Marklevitz here again to bring you another lecture video. Today we are continuing Unit 6, talking about documentary films, animated films, and experimental films, but we are moving away from the documentary style into animation. Now, this is a style of filmmaking that you are probably very familiar with, probably more familiar with than I am. This is the one unit that you could probably teach me more than I can teach you, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. So let's start off by talking about the basics of animation. Animation, what is it? We're all familiar with animated films and animated TV shows, but what are we actually talking about? Okay, so animation is the photographing of successive drawings or models to create an illusion of movement when those photographs are played back in a sequence. You've all seen flip books, right? You draw a picture of somebody walking down the street, and then you draw another picture that looks almost the same as the first picture, but you tweak a few things, and then you do that a couple thousand times, and when you flip those images at a high rate, it looks like the person is walking. They're not walking though, okay? It's an illusion. And how does that illusion work? Well, it has to do with something called the persistence of vision, the retention of a visual image after a stimulus is removed. Now, I'm going to date myself with this example, but when I was a kid, I remember watching Mr. Wizard's World on Canadian television, and in one particular episode, Mr. Wizard is trying to teach a young child about this idea of the persistence of vision. So he's spinning a light bulb and he's asking the little child, when I spin this light bulb very fast, what do you see? And the child explains that I see this, streaking light. But there is no streaking light, okay? The light bulb isn't changing shape, but it looks like the light is blurred because of the persistence of vision. Our brain is still processing where the light bulb was even after it's moved into a different location. And this is the basis not only of animation, but of filmmaking, okay? A frame is just a single photographic image, but when you pair that frame with another frame that is just slightly different than the original frame, and then you follow that frame with a third frame that looks slightly different than the one that came before it, and you play it back at a specific frame rate, it will look like the images are moving. But again, it's just an illusion due to our persistence of vision. And this discovery really led to the invention of cinema. Okay, the bet was whether or not a horse in full gallop ever had all four of its hooves off the ground at the same point. So they hired a photographer named Edward Muybridge to photograph a galloping horse with, several different cameras lined up. And when the horse passed by the cameras, they would trip these wires that would set off the cameras. And when they developed the photographs, they realized, well, yes, there is a moment in the galloping horse where all four hooves are off the ground, but they also realized that if you played these images back at a specific frame rate, it would look like the horse was galloping. Putting these frames together in a sequence and then playing them back at a specific speed gave the illusion of movement. And certainly the speed at which you're recording and the speed at which you're presenting matters a lot. We refer to this as the frame rate. So if you're shooting at a really low frame rate, something under 24 frames per second, you can get this really choppy motion like we see in this example from Austin Powers. Or maybe you want to show this dreamy look from something like Slumdog Millionaire. Or you could have a more normal frame rate, something between 24 frames and 30 frames per second. 24 frames is typically considered normal for American films. 30 frames per second is more typical with television. Great for shooting sports and concerts. Something with a lot of movement is great at 30 frames per second because you're not going to get that same amount of motion blur that you get at 24 frames. But I don't know, watching a film that was shot in 30 frames per second, it can look kind of cheap. There's this soap opera quality to it that I personally don't really like. I think it's season 3 of The Twilight Zone where they started to run out of money, so they shot half of the episodes on film at 24 frames per second, and then they shot half of the episodes on video at 30 frames per second. And there's just something about the episodes that were shot at 30 frames that feels kind of cheap. I don't really like them. And if I'm ever watching The Twilight Zone and one of those episodes comes on, I just turn it off because there's just something about that look that turns me off, okay? And then we have high frame rates. I would say anything above 60 frames per second is a high frame rate. These are great for, again, showing video that has a lot of movement, like a sporting event or a concert, but they're also great when you want to show slow motion, okay? If you're shooting at 24 frames per second and then you intend to use one of those shots to slow it down for that slow motion effect, well, that image is going to look really choppy because of the motion blur that comes with shooting at a lower frame rate, okay? But if you're shooting at 60 frames per second and then slowing that down to be presented at 24 frames per second, well, you're really going to start to see all of those different frames because you're shooting at such a high frame rate. That's why when, YouTubers want to show apples getting hit with arrows, they always are filming at a very high frame rate. In this case, thousands of frames per second, because they want you to see every single step in that process. But you wouldn't want to film an arrow being shot through an apple at a low frame rate, something like 24 frames per second or less, because you're just going to see this blurred flash of light and then the apple's going to explode, okay? If you want to see all of that crisp detail and that smooth movement, you need to be shooting at a very high frame rate. Again, something above 60 frames per second, so that when you slow it down, it looks nice and clean, all right? And there you go. Lesson 6.3, the basics of animation, and how ironic that I never talked about animation or showed you a single clip from an animated film, but we'll get there. We'll get there in lesson 6.4, all right, believe me. Your lab assignment for this week, guys, is to create a 15-second stop motion video. Stop motion is a type of animation that I'll get into more detail next week, but I wanted to give you this assignment in 6.3 because it's going to take us 2 lessons to get through. This is a time-consuming assignment, so I want to make sure that you get all the time that you need in order to complete it correctly, okay? So for the assignment, I have these little models here, but you can use an action figure that you have at home, something that has a lot of points of articulation. And all you're going to do is set up your little model, take a photograph, move it ever so slightly, take another photograph, do it again, take a picture, okay? And do that a couple hundred times. And when you take all of those images and play them back, it will look like your little character is moving, okay? So that will be our lab assignment for this week and next week. And speaking of stop motion animation, this week's film is The Fantastic Mr. Fox from 2009. This is a wonderful film from Wes Anderson that I really don't think got enough attention when it came out. But then again, stop motion, it's great for commercials, it's great for, California Raisins Christmas specials or something, but there really aren't too many feature-length stop motion films. I mean, you have A Nightmare Before Christmas and, all the work of Henry Selick. You have Wallace and Gromit and all the work of Nick Park. And you have, Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox and Isle of Dogs. But that's really it, I don't know if they just take too long and the studios just don't want to invest that much time, or maybe they know that, the audience isn't as willing to go to these movies as they are something, produced by Pixar. I don't know, but nevertheless, Fantastic Mr. Fox is a wonderful stop motion film that I'm excited to share with you. All right, so that's it, guys, for lesson 6.3. I hope you learned something, but email me if you have any questions or talk to me in class. And as always, thank you for watching. Bye.